Hello, New Prospect family. Welcome to RTB 2021 for June the 19th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. Sorry, you still have to look at my bandage here. I hope it's not too distracting for you. So we got some really interesting texts for today. We've got some pretty controversial texts for today. And I think one of the most beautiful texts in all of Scripture in Revelation 21. So our texts for today are Deuteronomy 24. We have two Psalms, Psalm 114, Psalm 115, Isaiah 51, and then finally Revelation 21. So we'll start with Deuteronomy 24 again. So with Deuteronomy, again, we're dealing with what we might call sundry laws, or a variety of different laws that deal with certain circumstances, all in the context of exhortation, once again. And in this case, they are in the context, I think, really setting Israel apart from the other nations surrounding them, particularly in its concern for justice and concern for those who could be taken advantage of by society. So, for instance, verse 17, you shall not pervert the justice due the alien, or the orphan, or the widow's, or take the widow's garment as a pledge. And so there's these protections for those who could be run over by society, those who have power in society, and this was a distinguishing mark of the Jewish people as they go into the promised land, that they're going to be looking out for those who might be taken advantage of. And I think it's still distinguishing mark for the church today. We especially see this, for instance, in the ministry of Jesus himself, don't we? But I think the most fascinating text in this chapter is Deuteronomy 24. Obviously, Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. This is obviously a pretty controversial text. It's a text dealing with divorce. And of course, during Jesus's day, people had used it in a way kind of to permit divorce. And of course, Jesus says, well, Moses just did this for the hardness of your heart, allowed it. But it was from the beginning not supposed to be that way. And then he cites Genesis 2 for that purpose of talking about the sanctity of marriage, ultimately. But I think this passage is actually was misread in Jesus's day by the scribes and Pharisees. And in fact, I think it deals with something a little bit deeper, which fits the context of this passage. And that is protecting, in this case, the woman in the divorce. So let me explain this. And this actually is an explanation that came from one of my former students, actually a former colleague of mine, I guess. She was a student with me at Southern Seminary when I was there with Dan Block. And she's now teaching Old Testament out at Multnomah Seminary in Oregon. And she wrote an excellent paper on this particular passage. Fascinating text, and fascinating paper, and this is what she argues. That, let me just give you kind of the setting here, that the man, you have two men involved here. You have an initial man who takes a wife and marries her, and then it happens that the text says it finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some indecency in her. Now that phrase is literally the nakedness of the thing, something indecent, and it really goes undefined here. It can do, if you look at the Old Testament, it can be a number of different things, but basically he doesn't like her anymore. Is the nature of the text. It's nothing. If it was an adultery, I think the text would specifically state this. So it's something less than that, something that is not necessarily grounds for a valid divorce, and he writes her a certificate of divorce anyway, and then sends her out of the house. In other words, this is a public social humiliation he's rejecting her publicly and exposing her to social degradation and humiliation. So what happens after that? Well, let's say that she goes out and she becomes another man's wife. The latter husband then turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce, or puts it and sends her out of the house, or if the latter husband dies. In other words, it really doesn't matter how that second marriage ends. What matters is it ended. So what happens if that second marriage ends? Can that first husband go, who sent her away, uh, come back and try to remarry her? Um, well, this text says no, for that is a quote abomination to the Lord. Well, why is that the case? Well, I think what the text is saying that he cannot be allowed to do that because he demonstrated that he cannot be trusted to care for her well-being in the first place, and thus his future rights over this woman is nullified ultimately. So it's a way. This text is a way of protecting. Um, yes, divorce is kind of the subject matter here, but it's more about protecting the abuse which divorce represents, especially in that culture. And so I think this is a strong commentary on yes, the sanctity of marriage and the seriousness of divorce, but it also, I think, adds elements of humanity and dignity to this topic, and treating um, those who again could be taken advantage of with respect and honor. So if you're interested in that paper, I can give you a copy of that. It was really well done on the part of Dr. Josberger. So let's move on to Psalm 114 and Psalm 115. Okay, Psalm 113 through 118 is a group of psalms. I didn't talk about this yesterday. The group of psalms that are known as the Egyptian Hallel, and Hallel is just dealing with praise of God, and the idea of them being Egyptian is from Psalm 114, where it mentions Israel going forth from Egypt, and it actually celebrates the deliverance of Israel from the Egyptians. These Hallel's psalms are sung at significant events in the Jewish calendar, specifically those pilgrimage festivals that are connected to the Exodus, and so they're very significant in the cultic life of Judaism even today. Um, as you look at that, let me draw your attention to a couple of, I think, significant passages in both of these Psalms. I was drawn immediately to now Psalm 114, again, talking about the deliverance of the Israelites in the Exodus, and specifically speaks of God as having control over nature and water, the sea, the Red Sea, and the Jordan River, in order to be able to deliver the Israelites. So God's power over these natural elements for the purpose of delivering his people. But I love verse 2 because it speaks of Judah being his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. Now it's picturing, what it's doing here is it's picturing the people of God in the Old Testament as God's temple, his tabernacle, basically, the place of his dwelling and the place of his rule. Now, if you've been with us on Sunday nights and even in Sunday mornings, I know I've talked about this before, that temple imagery temple is not just a place of worship for the people of God. It was also a place where God would rule. It was symbolic of his palace, and this is picturing God's people as that very thing. Well, guess what happens in the New Testament? God's people also pictured as the temple. In fact, we talked about this a few Sunday nights ago. We were talking about the church as the temple of God. We are that even today. We are his sanctuary. We are his dominion, you could say, even today in the New Covenant context. Psalm 115 is another of the Egyptian Hallel Psalms, and this one has a stark contrast between the glory due God, because he is the one true and living God, and then the idols that are made with human hands, that have eyes, mouths, ears, noses, hands, feet, and cannot do any of the things that a live person can do. They are dead. And the warning is in verse 8 is that those who make them will become like them, he who trusts in them. In other words, you follow after idolatry, you will stumble in it, and you become like those things that you worship. That's a pretty significant biblical teaching that's true across the board and true in many circumstances. You become like what you worship. As believers, we should be becoming like what we worship as well, right? In the person of Jesus Christ. So that's Psalm 115, 114 and 115. Brings us to Psalm 51. So again, we're continuing this passage, Psalm 40 through 55. I'm sorry, Isaiah 40 through, did I say Psalms? Isaiah 40 through 55. This is a section that is immediately following after the third of the servant songs. And also in a section, Isaiah 40 through 55, that is speaking specifically to comfort the Jewish people, and particularly those, the people of God, as they perhaps will experience a devastating judgment like the exile. I didn't mention this yesterday, I don't think, but at the end of chapter 50, in verses 10 and 11, there's an exhortation of a response to the servant that is detailed in chapter 50, verses 4 through 11. So how should you respond? Well, you should fear the Lord and obey the voice of the servant. And if you don't, you'll find yourself lying down in torment. That's a pretty stark contrast of response. But then in chapter 51, what we have here is a section that gives some incentives for obeying the voice of the servant. So for instance, verses 1 through 3 give the incentive that that if God can make a great nation from one barren couple, Abraham and Sarah, then he can revive Zion as a new joyful Eden. It's an encouragement for the Israelites. Some other encouragements for the Israelites, especially as they might be experiencing exile, is that God is the one who comforts them, verse 12. Another picture that you often find as a promise for people who have been scattered to the lands, they will experience a return to the land and what is often described as a new exodus. So in verse 11, for instance, so the ransom of the Lord will return and will come with joyful shouting to Zion, and everlasting joy will be on their heads. The promise in verse 14, the exile will soon be free and will not die in a dungeon, nor will his bread be lacking. So what we find in chapter 51 are many of these encouragements that God is contending, verse 22, contending for his people. He is comforting his people, and he's going to ultimately return his people to the promised land. And the means by which the people will be restored, of course, will be this servant individual who we know as Jesus the Christ. And that brings us finally to Revelation. So in Revelation 21, we have, of course, the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. Once again, behind this text are many Old Testament texts. And I would just encourage you, as you read through this picture of the new heavens and the earth, understand that especially if you have a study Bible, just go through and look at all the cross references and see how John is painting this picture of the glory of the new heavens and the new earth, specifically through the lens of the Old Testament. Of course, this frames the entirety of the Bible, doesn't it? The storyline of the Bible is a story that ends here. It's a story that begins with a creation that is very good in Genesis 1 and 2. It's a story of a creation where God is ruling over his creation. But then the people that God creates to rule over his creation for him, his vice regents, his image bearers, what happens? They rebel against God, right? And so creation falls. And the rest of the story of the Bible is about how that old creation is being restored. Well, here it is right here. The new creation, the new heavens and new earth is restoring that which has fallen. A great picture of this is just the simple statement in verse 1 of chapter 21 that there's no longer any sea. Well, if you read verse 1 of, verse 2 of Genesis 1, you'll see that that you have a couple of things that are wrong with creation. It's dark, right? And then there's formless and void, and darkness is over the surface of the deep. The sea in the ancient context would represent chaos. And what does God do? He comes and brings order to the chaos. He makes it into the place of his rule. Um, and so here, God has removed all of that. There's no sea anymore. God has removed the chaos. He has created a new creation that will be perfect and be that place of his rule, which is significant, of course, for the New Jerusalem as well. Behind much of what we find in the New Jerusalem passages in Ezekiel 40 through 48, which is, of course, that passage that speaks of the new temple. But the what strikes me about this whole thing, this whole passage, two things. Number one, John uses lots of analogical language here. In other words, he uses things that try to give us earthly things that try to give us a picture of the glory of what it's going to be like, but is really just scratching the surface. Streets of gold and pearly gates. These are just scratching the surface of the actual glory. The second thing is that what brings this place glory is, of course, God's presence among his people. And so among the bride. And verse 22 is a great statement of that. I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. In other words, there's no need for a place for God to dwell, because God will be dwelling with his people in the entirety. And who gets to enjoy this? Those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, those who have experienced the justification, the cleansing, the adoption, the reconciliation, the redemption, all those pictures of salvation we found and talked about in our recent sermon series. Those are the people who will experience this new heavens and new earth in the presence of a holy God, where he wipes all our tears away, and where he removes any death, crying, and pain. What a wonderful promise this is in Revelation 21. And almost done with the New Testament. One more passage. So I hope you have a great rest of the day, and hope you're encouraged by a passage like this on this day, June 19th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.